talk for a moment about stories. Specifically, let's talk about a certain class of story. A story where the protagonist, aka hero, and the villain, aka the antagonist, are in opposition to one another. Where the story is told from a single perspective following this conflict between the hero and villain. Now, granted, in these stories, when we say hero and villain or a protagonist and antagonist, it doesn't necessarily mean one person. A hero or a villain can be a group or an entire story world. The key to these stories are opposing viewpoints. Let me propose something about them. These stories are defined by the protagonist or hero. The hero defines what type of story is going on. But your hero in these stories is always defined by the villain. But your villain is always defined by the type of story you're writing, because the villain is an outgrowth of the story and the moral argument. But your story is defined by the hero. Okay, back up a second. In short, a hero and a villain, and the difference between the two, define this type of story. Before I get into more about what is the difference between a hero and a villain, I would like to define two terms. The first is the term of competence. Competence, how much the character is perceived by the audience as being able to achieve their goals. For example, a zombie horde is perceived by an audience as being very competent because they want to kill people and they do it very well. Granted, other tasks to a zombie, such as walking or sentences, not so great at. On the other hand, the scientist that created a zombie horde would be considered very low in competence because the scientist was not intending to create zombies, he was trying to make money and failed. Second term we need to define, malice. Malice is the propensity of a character to do something that the audience finds reprehensible. Say a character got his wallet stolen. If the character then hunts down the thief and kills them, we would say that character has a pretty high malice. On the other hand, if the character who got his wallet stolen hunts down the thief and then writes him a very sternly worded letter expressing his deep disappointment in the thief, we would say that character has a very low malice. These are the two characteristics that define the difference between the hero and the villain. We're going to create a graph here with malice on the y-axis and competence on the x-axis. And the resulting line between the villain and the hero, when graphing their malice and competence against each other, we are going to refer to as the story vector. Let's start off with your standard action-adventure story vector. The villain, who is a maniac, faces off against the hero, who is your standard action hero. The difference between the maniac and the action hero is very small on the competence meter. The real difference between the two is the difference with malice. There is a clear moral difference between the hero and the villain, with the hero being morally superior to the villain in the story. If we lower the malice difference but keep the competence differential about the same, you end up with a sympathetic villain versus an everyman hero. And this sort of defines a bittersweet vector. Here, the hero does win, but at the same time, we feel for the villain because there's not much difference between the villain and the hero. On the other end of the spectrum, if we have high malice difference and high competence difference, you have a character that is a cartoon villain chewing the scenery versus a paragon of virtue. This is your standard Saturday morning cartoon vector. If the competence differences are quite skewed in the hero's favor, but the malice differences are not, then you have a vector for the tragic villain versus the anti-hero. This is your tragic villain vector. The vectors we've been looking at are the happy ending vectors. If we divide a chart into quadrants, you can see that quadrants 2 and 4 correspond to the happy endings. The odd number quadrants, 3 and 1, are for our tragic endings. So looking at our tragic endings, the first one we're going to take a look at is a situation where the villain is only slightly more competent than the hero. In this case, we're looking at a case of a corrupt villain versus a martyr. This is actually your saint story. Now, if we reduce the Malice difference, so the hero is slightly less competent than the villain, and the hero is not that difference in Malice either, this is your standard Noir vector, where you have a personal demon versus a hero in over their head. The hero has a flaw in their personality that is going to lead to their downfall. If you greatly increase the difference between competence, but yet again have a hero that is flawed, and the Malice difference is relatively small, you're now talking about your sort of art house vector, your 1984 vector, where the hero has no chance of ever winning. So you have a tragic hero versus an overpowering system. If you have high Malice and high competence difference, here you have your horror story. The villain is a killing machine, remorseless and evil. The heroes are simply tasty snacks for the villain on their rampage. Those are our standard vectors. One thing to remember about these vectors, it is relative difference. It is not an absolute measure. For example, in the movie Die Hard, John McClane is considered to have a high moral difference between his opponent, but John McClane kills a ton of people in that movie. We only see him as greatly superior in moral standing because of the villain he's facing. If, for example, Rainbow Bright employed the same guns-blazing approach against her nemesis, Murky Dismal, whose master plan is to make people somewhat sad, then we would not see Rainbow Bright as quite a positive light, because the relative difference is the defining factor. That Rainbow Bright movie would be epic. But that's not the point here. It is the relative difference that defines the perception of competence and perception of malice of the hero and the villain, and their relative differences define the story vector. But this is not the only part of our story, because there's one more thing we have to add to our chart. We have to add the factor of time. Stories are not usually about heroes standing still. They're about a hero changing over a period of time. When you add the factor of time, you then go from a story vector to a plot. Take, for example, your standard horror plot. The standard horror plot starts off with the villain being an unstoppable killing machine, greatly superior in malice and competence to the hero. The hero starts off in the victim category, but as the plot progresses, the heroes become more competent, moving up to the martyr status until at the very end, your last hero standing actually has a superior competence to the villain and is able to defeat them. Let's take a look at a different one, the monomyth detailed by Joseph Campbell. This is your standard fantasy story plot. In the monomyth, the hero starts off in a paragon role. Everything's perfect, and the evils that he faces are relatively small. As we transition through the hero cycle, we see that his competence and moral superiority begins to drop. He's taken from a paragon to an everyman hero until eventually the hero is in over their head. At that darkest point, the hero takes a turn, gaining moral superiority, heading back down into the martyr category, and at the very end facing off against the villain in the action hero stand, winning at the very end. So how do we accomplish change within the story? Well, we accomplish change within the story in one of three ways. The first and most common way to change it is to change one of the characters, either the villain or the hero, because remember, it is the relative difference that represents change. So changing either the hero or the villain changes the nature of our story. But that's not the only way we've changed the story. Remember, this is about perception. So malice and competence are perceived values. You can change the perception of a character while keeping the character absolutely the same by simply giving new information. Example: the cliff fight scene in The Princess Bride. You have two changes in competence between the heroes, with the simple phrase, "I am not left-handed." Even though the characters do not change in any way, the perception of the audience changes. A third way to produce change is simply to add or remove characters from the mix. Remember, we're representing these scales as a protagonist versus an antagonist. We do not have to say they are the same protagonist and antagonist throughout the entire story. And those are the three ways we produce a plot by changing the nature of the story. A plot is about a cycle of change in perception of what the story is about. As the story becomes more dire, as it looks like the heroes are in more danger, that produces tension. As they get back into a story where it appears that the heroes are more in control, that releases tension. Now, one disclaimer I do have to say about story vectors. It is based off of a standard Judeo-Christian Western view that the success or failure of a character is based off of their individual skill and their moral virtue. If you are trying to apply it to a story that does not have that Judeo-Christian view, you're not going to have this graph be effective. So I've done a lot of talking here. What's the point? How do we use this graph? Well, I've given a few guidelines on how I think it is used in stories, but I'm really leaving that up to you, if there is any use to this. So I've given you this piece of the puzzle. It's your time to figure out if there's anything you can do with it.